Good morning. In the next hour, we'll travel through the decades from 1960 to 2025, tracing how Unitarian Universalism reinvented itself again and again around three intertwined commitments: freedom of conscience, covenantal community, and public witness. And we'll mark turning points, meet key figures, and surface the unresolved questions that shape our faith today. So, just like the history of the United States, there are some high points and low points. However, we're not going to edit out the low points. So, let's start with the formation of the UUA. So, here's our agenda. It's a lot of decades between 1960 and now. But we're going to start with the consolidation, the birth of the UUA. So the American Unitarian Association and the Universalist Church of America came together after decades of courtship, culminating in a Boston ceremony on May 15th, 1961, that created the Unitarian Universalist Association. Interestingly, it was the youth of the two denominations that were the early catalysts. They merged their own national groups years before 1961, built working relationships across the two traditions, and even supplied the movement with its merger anthem. So what did they do? First, they tried this in the 1930s. Unitarian and Universalist youth leaders pushed for union well before the adults. And a youth-led attempt in the 1930s didn't stick, but it set a pattern of cooperation. In the 40s, the two youth bodies co-published The Young Liberal after World War II and convened joint conferences normalizing collaboration. They merged before the adults. The American Unitarian Youth and the Universalist Youth Fellowship voted to merge in 1953, launching Liberal Religious Youth, LRY, and holding LRI's first Continental Convention in 1954. This youth merger became a model and momentum builder for the 1961 consolidation. And they gave the merger a soundtrack. The hymn, We Would Be One, written for the 1954 Youth Convention, became an emblem of consolidation. And Carl's going to lead us in that song. All right. Good job. So when the UUA formed in 1961, LRY, the Young or Liberal Religious Youth, became its youth arm, carrying forward a truly cross-denominational youth culture. So why did this matter? They did the proof of concept. Youth showed a merged organization could function, program, and gather across the old denominational lines years before the adult vote. And the youth groups continued to move toward a merger, and that their efforts helped facilitate the AUA and UCA consolidation. And there was a shared identity. There were camps and conferences and publications forged friendships and a common UU language among teens, reducing the cultural distance. Adults were still negotiation. So you might ask, why did it take so long for the Unitarians and Universalists to consolidate? Because even with lots in common, the two movements had very different cultures, theologies, and organizations. And it took decades of trial runs and careful votes to knit that all together. So here's some of the big factors. Different social bases. In the US, Unitarians were concentrated in educated urban New England circles, while Universalists were more rural and working class, and many were African American. Those contrasting identities bred mutual wariness about being dominated or diluted. There was a theological distance up until the point where it narrowed. For much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, Universalists remained more explicitly Christian, believing in universal salvation, while many Unitarians moved toward creedless, even humanist religion. And that gap only really narrowed in the 1920s and 30s as religious humanism spread among Unitarians, and both groups embraced broader liberal theology. Then there's the organizational and money headaches. The Universalist Church had strong, semi-independent state conventions and a comparatively weak center. Unitarians were structured differently. Early joint bodies like the Council of Liberal Churches struggled, especially with financing, and couldn't easily fuse publications such as religious education, curricula, pensions, and other operations. And congregational polity, which is a slow, bottom-up decision-making. Because both traditions are fiercely congregational, leaders couldn't just decree a merger. The Joint Merger Commission in 1956 staged a thorough, years-long process with reports to every congregation, the direct vote of all the members in 1959, another continental meeting in 1960, and only then a formal vote and new bylaws in May of 1961. And there was identity fears on both sides. Many Universalists worried that they'd be swallowed by the merger, by the larger and better resourced AUA, and some Unitarians feared that joining would slow Unitarian growth or pull the new body back toward a more narrowly Christian identity. And those anxieties had to be worked through in study papers, debates, and local votes. Put simply, culture, creed, and structure had to catch up with their shared values. Once theology converged enough and the organizational kinks were mapped, consolidation became possible and brought the American Unitarian Association and the Universalist Church of America together after decades of courtship, culminating in a Boston ceremony on May 15th, 1961, that created the Unitarian Universalist Association. And one of the things they did is that they created, in small text, but they created 6 principles. And one thing I want to point out is the boldface is kind of patriarchal. So they adopted this set of 6 principles and a 15-year bylaw review cycle that would matter later. And they also created a song or hymn that Carl will share with us.
The song in question is hymn number 145, As Tranquil Streams. If you actually might want to, we've got the slides, but if you might want to actually pull out some physical hymnals to take a look at this. It is also the same hymn tune as number 345 with Joy We Claim the Growing Light. This is actually very common. We saw it with We Would Be One as well, is from the hymn tune Finlandia by the composer Sibelius. And in fact, if you turn to the back of the hymnal in page 661, you'll see an index of the hymn tunes. There's all sorts of little interesting things if you've ever taken a deep dive into the deep dark back of the hymnal. So you can see the hymn tunes, and a lot of those tunes have multiple hymns that were written to them, and this is one. So this is from the Reverend Kimberly Debus, who runs an incredible website and blog called Notes from the Far Fringe, where she has written a little reflection on every hymn in the gray and teal hymnal. She is our denomination's really foremost hymnody expert. So this is from Reverend Kimberly. Now, those who know the history of this hymn will know why. For those who don't, here's a short version. Marion Franklin Ham wrote the lyric in 1933 in advance of the first shared hymnal by the AUA and UCA, Hymns of the Spirit. This 1933 hymnal was the first official published collaboration between Unitarians and Universalists. This is the red hymnal. Yep. Yes, this is the red one. And so this hymn was written for this collaborative project. So as the final votes were cast and the new Unitarian Universalist Association was formed in 1961, the assembled sang this very singable hymn together. So I'll play through it once, and then we shall all sing it.
Thank you, Carl. So, the UUA almost immediately confronted the civil rights struggle. Hundreds of ministers and lay UUs answered Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s call to Selma in March 1965. And most of this history was or will be shared in today's worship service, depending on which service you're going to. The association also joined anti-war protests and supported conscientious objectors, extending a tradition of peace witness. Membership initially grew, but activism raised expectations that the denomination itself reflect the justice it preached. And this led to something they called ministry to the movement. What does that mean? In simple words, it means treating social movements like the civil rights movement or the peace movement not as someone else's thing, but as a place where our ministry belongs. Not just sermons on Sunday, but showing up as clergy, lay leaders, youth, and families to comfort, to organize, to witness, and to share risk. So picture the 1960s. Across the United States, people are marching, singing, registering voters, sitting in, facing dogs and tear gas, and saying, "This country must include all of us." And when the call went out, sometimes from Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. himself, hundreds of UU ministers and lay people traveled to southern towns and to northern solidarity actions. They didn't come as celebrities. They came to serve, to drive people safely, to raise bail money, to offer nonviolence training, to lead songs, to preach in borrowed pulpits, and maybe, most important, to show public love in dangerous places. And it wasn't only in the South. UU congregations hosted freedom schools, staffed phone trees, served sandwiches and coffee to exhausted organizers, and turned fellowship halls into safe meeting spaces. Movement ministry also came inside of our denomination. Black Unitarian Universalists organized for voice, power, and resources. And many white UUs learned, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes painfully, what it meant to follow the lead of Black colleagues and lay leaders, to make funding commitments, to keep promises, and to stay at the table when conflict got hot. Those years changed our faith. We didn't do everything well. We didn't always keep trust, but we were being taught by history itself what solidarity asks of us. So at the same time, UUs joined a widening circle of movements: peace and draft counseling, women's liberation, gay and lesbian rights, as it was named then, environmental justice. Wherever people gathered to widen the circle of human dignity, UUs tried to bring chaplaincy, logistics, music, and moral clarity, and to receive wisdom from partners who did not share our theology, but shared our hope. And here is the hopeful part. Ministry to the movement did not end in 1969, or 79, or 99. Every generation gets its own invitations. Today, it looks like court support teams, climate vigils, mutual aid pantries, sanctuary congregations, and youth-led campaigns for safe schools and fair votes. It still looks like presence, care, and shared risk. A quick note, a side note, Martin Luther King Jr. was our keynote speaker at the 1966 UUA General Assembly, and he challenged the church not to sleep through the revolution, insisting the church must act as a moral guardian and declare segregation morally wrong. Side note part 2, while studying in Boston in the early 1950s, Martin and Coretta Scott King visited Unitarian churches, notably the Arlington Street Church, and seriously considered becoming Unitarian, but decided they could not build a mass black-led movement from within a mostly white, culturally different denomination. Mandy made reference to this during the service, and you'll hear about it if you are going to the second service, is the black empowerment controversy, or the white supremacy controversy. It was a deep 3-year fight inside the new UUA about black self-determination, money, and who sets the agenda for racial justice. Black UUs organized to lead their own program, the Black Affairs Council, BAC, and asked the denomination to fund it. Many white UUs backed them and others proposed a integrationalist alternative, and then finances crashed, tempers flared, and trust was badly broken. So here's what happened. So in 1967, there were the Newark and Detroit uprisings, also called the rebellions or the riots. And they were 2 of the largest and deadliest episodes of urban unrest during the civil rights era. Both erupted in the summer of 1967 amid long simmering racial injustice, police brutality, segregation, and economic marginalization in majority black neighborhoods. So after the Newark, Detroit uprisings, the UUA's Commission on Religion and Race convened an emergency conference, and black participants formed the Black Unitarian Universalist Caucus, BUUC, which called for a black-led Black Affairs Council, the BAC, to coordinate UU work for black empowerment. Well, in 1968, at the General Assembly, delegates recognized the BAC and voted $1 million over 4 years for its black-led program of action. A white support network, Fullback, was formed. Fullback was the fundraising campaign, and it was Fund for UU Liberation for BAC. Created a channel congregational pledges. It was created to channel congregational pledges and UUA resources directly to BAC's programs and to the wider black community, instead of routing them through the UUA's usual board-controlled budget process. A rival group, Black and White Action, BAWA, B-A-W-A, argued for more integrated approaches, and BAWA represented those mostly white UUs and some ministers who wanted the UUA to continue with a racial justice strategy focused on integrationalist programs rather than funding a separate black-controlled organization. So in 1969 was the showdown. Amid a budget crisis, the board tried to limit or redirect funds, and many black UUs and their white allies demanded that the UUA honor the 1968 General Assembly vote to give the BAC $1 million over 4 years. Opponents objected to this amount, and that it was a direct grant model, and that the BAC's insistence on autonomy. The BAWA pushed the UUA board to rescind or reduce the promised funding to the BAC, and they passed a hotly contested motion which replaced the $1 million pledge with a smaller, more restricted grant. BAWA's rise and the UUA's reversal under their pressure became a major breaking point, prompting many black UUs and their allies to leave UU congregations in protest. In 1970, there was a break with the UUA. Funding disputes, mismanagement led the BAC to disaffiliate from the UUA, and later splits and even litigation followed. Black membership and participation declined sharply. So why does this matter? It is a defining UU case study in shared power versus helping, and in how money and governance shape racial justice work. And the controversy left lasting wounds, and also seeded practices that inform UU racial justice commitments today. And the controversy forced Unitarians to confront systemic racism inside the liberal church, a lesson that keeps resurfacing. Let's jump into the 70s. The 1970s feminist turn in Unitarian Universalism was a denomination-wide shift, driven largely by lay women, that named and dismantled sexism in UU theology, language, and structures. The watershed was the 1977 Women and Religion Resolution at the General Assembly in Ithaca, New York, which unanimously called UUs to examine patriarchal roots in religion and to change worship, curricula, and leadership practices. And it launched a Women and Religion Task Force and a continent-wide movement. District women and religion groups and revisions of hymns and readings followed. And the movement birthed new liturgy and learning, notably the water ritual in 1980 and the adult RE curriculum Cakes for the Queen of Heaven that centered women's experience and inclusive language. It also helped shape UU identity, fueling the 1985 rewrite of the UU principles, more inclusive language, and the interdependent web, and accelerating the rise of women in ministry. The General Assembly urged more women to join the ministry. So women were about 6% of UU clergy in 1978, and then about 25% by 1988, and then later a majority. In short, lay-led push became structural change, transforming worship, teaching, and who holds power. In the 1980s, the UUA shifted into welcoming and expansion, meaning it widened who fully belonged and broadened its reach. LGBTQ+ inclusion moved from sentimental to structure. UU ministers had performed same-sex unions since 1957, but in 1984, General Assembly formally affirmed rituals for gay and lesbian couples, the first major U.S. denomination to do so. In responding to the AIDS crisis and rising homophobia, the 1989 GA General Assembly launched the Welcoming Congregation Program. Congregations earned the designation through education, public witness, and policy change, and by 2019, 3/4 of U.S. congregations were welcoming. And we became welcoming in 2000? It's either 99 or 2000. And that was a vote that our church took, and it was overwhelmingly unanimous. So the principles were refreshed in 1985. Delegates revised Article 2, expanding the principles to the familiar 7, adding the 6th source, and locking in non-sexist language reinforced a broader, more expansive UU identity. So you can see where in the first version there was a lot of mankind, brotherhood. In the 1980s version of the principles, person, human relations, all. It was more inclusive. So more women were in ministry, which meant that there was a different center of gravity. And as I said, the share of women clergy jumped from 6% in 1978 to about 25% in 1988, accelerating culture change in pulpits and leadership. And new theological and global connections grew. The decades seeded UU pagan organizing the cups, which began in 1985, which is the sanctioned pagan group with the UUA. It laid groundwork for stronger international ties. So bottom line, the 1980s took UU values and built systems, training, policies, and leadership pipelines that made welcome, real, and expanded who sees UUism as home. So in the 90s, it was built on ecology, global partnership, and the youth. So ecology, grassroots UUs launched the 7th Principle Project and published the first Green Sanctuary Handbook, a do-it-yourself congregational pathway that blended worship, religious education, building practices, as in the facility practices, and public witness. This work evolved into the UU Ministry for Earth and later migrated into an official UUA program. And our church also was awarded the Green Sanctuary Award or designation. Thank you. Global partnership. Congregations deepen ties with international Unitarian UU communities through the UU Partner Church Council, building hundreds of partnerships, especially with Transylvanian Unitarians. And our church used to be a partner church with a church in Transylvania. Our ministers would trade letters with each other to share what is happening in our church, and sometimes we would raise money to send to their church. And this is what was our partner church. It's in a village named Dapka. At the movement level, the International Council of Unitarians and Universalists, the ICUU, formed in 1995 to connect national bodies worldwide. The ICUU linked emerging movements in the Philippines, India, Uganda, South Africa, and beyond, challenging UU-centric governance. And the youth and young adults. The decade consolidated youth empowerment culture and expanded young adult ministry. The UUA's young adult and campus ministry infrastructure grew, with the number of young adult groups rising from about 100 in 1997 to 250 by 2003. Youth and young adults were visible at General Assembly through the youth caucuses and the young adult caucuses, and engaged in justice campaigns while the denomination adopted the 1997 Journey Toward Wholeness anti-racism resolution that shaped youth and young adult training and leadership. And that moves us into the 2000s, the post-9/11 public witness and immigration. So here's a quick arc of post-9/11 public witness and immigration in the UUA. So civil liberties and anti-torture. After 9/11, UUs joined interfaith work to defend due process and oppose torture. The UUA passed actions of immediate witness denouncing US-sponsored torture and aligned with the National Religious Campaign Against Torture. We had a public witness of love. In 2009, the UUA launched Standing on the Side of Love, later renamed Side with Love, to avoid ableist language. An out-facing banner for UU advocacy, especially around LGBTQ equality and immigrant rights. The New Sanctuary Revival. The UUA became the first national denomination to endorse the New Sanctuary movement, encouraging congregations to accompany and shelter people at risk of deportation. Many later declared sanctuary status. And immigration as a denominational priority. After study and organizing, GA adopted the Statement of Conscience, Immigration as a Moral Issue in 2013, giving a long-term guidance for education, policy change, and public witness. And in 2012, we had the Justice GA, and this was in Phoenix. So with Arizona's State Bill 1070 as a backdrop, General Assembly met in Phoenix as a Justice GA, centering immigrant-led trainings and mass witness instead of typical business-as-usual programming. We focused on immigrant rights after Arizona's SB 1070s, and thousands of UUs joined desert protests outside detention centers located, and it was led by local Latinx activists. It was quite the scene because we were all wearing our yellow Siding with Love shirts. So it was just a flood of yellow directly right outside the detainment centers. We could hear the people in the detainment center and they could hear us. Training and partnership. The UU College of Social Justice launched in 2012 to equip UUs with spiritually grounded organizing skills tied to immigrant and human rights partners. And we had the Trump era response. The UUA and UUSC issued a Declaration of Conscience and co-created Love Resists to expand sanctuary, rapid response, and decriminalization efforts. Dozens of UU congregations publicly offered sanctuary. Bottom line, in post 9/11, the UUA knits civil liberties defense and immigrant justice work into a sustained partner-led public witness, moving from statements to structure, and keeping love as the organizing message. In the 2010s, white supremacy teach-ins and leadership change. So in 2015, the Black Lives of UU organized to center Black UU voices and pastoral care, raising expectations for structural change. However, in 2017, a hiring controversy in the spring of 2017, where another white hire to lead the southern region triggered a denomination-wide reckoning with white supremacy culture in the UU systems. And UUA President Peter Morales resigned, and 2 other senior leaders soon stepped down. That spring, Black Lives of UU called for nationwide white supremacy teach-ins to examine internalized racism. UU religious educators and ministers launched the UU White Supremacy Teach-In between April and June of 2017, and 70%, over 700 congregations, ran worship and religious education sessions naming and dismantling white supremacy culture. And a second wave followed after the incident in Charlottesville. We had leadership change. After Morales resigned, the board appointed 3 interim co-presidents, Reverend Sophia Betancourt, Reverend William G. Sinkford, and Dr. Leon Spencer, to stabilize governance and center anti-racism work. At the General Assembly in New Orleans in 2017, delegates elected Reverend Susan Frederick Gray as UUA president, the first woman elected in the role, marking a new mandate to deepen equity and inclusion. The board created the Commission on Institutional Change in 2017. Its 2020 report, Widening the Circle of Concern, laid out system-level reforms for culture, governance, theology, and ministry. So in the 2010s, UUs moved from ad hoc responses to a frank, denomination-wide process, naming white supremacy culture, changing leadership, and adopting concrete, long-term reforms guided by the Commission on Institutional Change and heavily influenced by the Black Lives UU organizing and the teach-ins. Widening the Circle, Article 2 and the new presidency in the 2020s. So in June 2020, the UUA's Commission on Institutional Change released Widening the Circle of Concern, a 240-page report examining how white supremacy culture and systemic racism show up in UU systems, and offering concrete recommendations through governance, theology, ministerial formation, congregational life, conflict engagement, finance, metrics, and more. It became a denomination-wide study of and action focus that many congregations took up with classes, boards, and teams. One of the programs that came out of that is a religious education program called Mosaic that is lifespan, so it has lessons from first grade all the way up through adult. And we will be doing it this coming winter, January through March. So the kids will be doing it, and we'll be offering opportunities for adults to participate in these programs. So during 2020 through 2024, following years of study and feedback, the Article 2 Study Commission proposed replacing the 7 principles. So if you remember, I talked about when the UUA formed in 1961, the bylaws that they had was that every 15 years they had to review the bylaws, review Article 2, which was our principles and sources. So this is the process. And it had done it a number of times, and they tried doing big change a couple times, and it was just rejected outright. This was the first time that a whole change, completely top to bottom, has occurred since the original formation in 1961. So they proposed replacing the 7 principles with a values and covenant statement centering love. Delegates gave preliminary approval to the comprehensive Article 2 rewrite at General Assembly 2023, moving it to a binding vote the next year. And in June 2024, after amendments, delegates passed the revision by 80%. Adding values of interdependence, equity, transformation, pluralism, generosity, and justice with an updated covenant and source framing. And you'll often hear the mnemonic JETPIG: justice, equity, transformation, pluralism, interdependence, generosity. And new presidency. In 2023, Reverend Dr. Sophia Bettencourt was elected UUA president at General Assembly 2023. She is the first woman of color and the first openly queer person to lead the association, widely noted as a milestone aligned with the denomination's equity commitments. Public reporting during General Assembly 2024 highlights the administration's ongoing emphasis on communal care, justice work, and implementing movement-level priorities surfaced through the Widening the Circle and the Article 2 process. So how do these pieces fit together? Widening the Circle provided the diagnosis and the roadmap for structural, cultural change. The Article 2 rewrite updated the theological and covenantal center to match that vision. So love at the center and JETPIG as lived commitments. And under President Betancourt, the UUA has been advancing that alignment at the denominational level while congregations localize it through governance, formation, worship, and justice ministries. So at merger, the new denomination counted about 151,000 members in 651 congregations, concentrated in New England and the upper Midwest. It would peak near 177,000 in 1968 before a long slide, and part of it was the Black Power or Black empowerment controversy. We lost a lot of people during that. So today, the UUA serves 1,081 communities, 1,000 member congregations, plus emerging covenanting and international groups. Certified adult membership in the U.S. hovers around 147,000. And Sunday attendance is lower, but online reach is higher than pre-pandemic. And demographers note aging cohorts and slow gains among people of color despite anti-racism commitments. So looking ahead, ongoing work, adopting the new Article 2 at the congregational level, funding recommendations from Widening the Circle, amplifying youth and young adult voices, and living into the covenant of interdependence amid climate crisis. We are a living faith, and a living faith never stays still, as Reverend Betancourt reminds us. We are always becoming. And the last 65 years prove UUism can risk change to align deeds with aspirations, an unfinished sacred experiment. Do you have any questions? Any clarifications, Joan?
When you're talking about how active, and I'll just say Boston for the, they were in the 60s and 70s in terms of all the turmoil that we were going through. And maybe I'm not reading enough now, but we're going through a lot of turmoil right now.
Yeah.
And I'd like to feel, Mandy's great, but I'd like to feel like as a UUA, we can come out and say, stop doing this shit,
Well, and they are saying stop doing this shit. And the thing is to be able to, there's some things that the UUA can say that, that say as the leaders of the UUA, we condemn this or condemn that. But if there is going to be a statement of conscience like we do, so when our church does a statement of conscience, everybody has to vote on it. We have to have a near unanimous vote. So it still it happens that way as a denomination, but it's bottom up. So it's slow as molasses because it has to happen at a General Assembly, but it also there has to be learnings at the church level so that they know how they want to vote, and then they need to edit it until they get all the words right, which takes time. So a lot of that, it just takes time because we're at the speed of church. But that doesn't mean it will be.
It will be. Thank you, Justin. So yeah, what Steve's talking about is all the congregational polity stuff, right? Like we can't the board can only make statements on behalf of the congregation on behalf of the statements of conscience, right? Like we couldn't arbitrarily go out and talk about immigration, for instance, as a congregation because we don't have a statement of conscience on immigration. I can talk about it from a values perspective, but I can't actually say anything about immigration as the minister or the board because the congregation has not voted on immigration. It is the downfall of congregational polity. It's great because you're a democratic church and so everybody gets a voice and a vote, but it sucks when you have to make decisions like what you're talking about. With that said, the UUA, because it does have some things already aligned, has already made some statements. So for instance, we've already had the statement of conscience that Steve was talking about around immigration. I think it's also a CSAI too, right. Which is a immediate witness piece. So the UUA was involved in a lawsuit in DC with other sanctuary congregations opposing ICE. They are also currently in a brief in Colorado around LGBTQ issues. And so there are things happening, but they can only do as much as has been voted on by General Assembly.
Suzanne.
So we talked about during the civil rights movement, a lot of UU ministers went to those protests, one many died. What about like the Chicago UU ministers, like going to the ICE protests that are happening, around Chicago? Has that been talked about, or how does that work? Can you repeat the question?
So the question was about how Chicago area ministers are showing up in this area for justice issues, comparing it somewhat to the civil rights movement. So there are certain so ministers are showing up in different capacities as we're able to. I've been to some of the Chicago protests. Beth Johnson is from Hinsdale is the one that is like, she's everywhere right now, as is Allison Farnham from UUPMI, yeah. And Scott Ossian is doing a little bit of work as well from the UUANI. So there are some of us that we're kind of tag teaming, seeing who can go, where our presence is most needed. Just depends on what particular issue, where, when.
Let's say you went to an ICE facility.
Mm-hmm.
Would you be allowed in your role to make like a statement to the press about where our church is?
I can make a statement to the press. But it is my statement to the press. I cannot do it on behalf of the congregation. That is a part of our congregational polity. I cannot speak on behalf of the congregation unless the board has given me permission, and it is something that you all have a statement of conscience about. We're all in alignment on that particular issue.
Russ.
It seems that the UUA really shot itself in the foot in the 1980s working with the black issue. And what concerns me about that, I wasn't in the church at the time, so I don't have a feel for the history, although I think you did a good job of explaining it, I can understand it. But what it makes me wonder is how introspective has the organization been about that mistake? And what would have been done better? Because I'm thinking of all kinds of alternatives that could have been taken care of between the people who want an integrated approach and a separate approach. And I say shot in the foot because, as you said, it had long-term consequences, financial, membership, everything else. To this day, we struggle to get people of color into the organization. And what I'm wondering, does anybody, and I know you can't rewrite history, and it's a big waste of time to lament the past, but is anybody looking at that and saying, is there any way we can undo that mistake today by some kind of proactive
So the Commission on Institutional Change is all about that. So it is looking within. So some of the things that happened during the Black empowerment controversy, some things were done for the right reason, but probably done in the wrong way. So channeling money directly to the group rather than having it as part of a budget item, they could have done that differently. And I think that caused some hot issues. But some of those hot issues because they didn't like the idea that it was a Black-led, they were making their own choices, they were autonomous. They didn't like the fact that Blacks were in control of this group that is part of the UUA. So there was bad things done for bad reasons. There were bad things done with good intentions, and that's all the learning process. And I mean, that's the way history is. You learn from, history. But yes, it is not being ignored that this happened. It is being looked at, and that committee on institutional change, that is their big focus, is looking at all that history. What can we do different? How can we make white supremacy from within more aware to the people within?
I would also add that when BLUE, Black Lives of UU, formed, the UUA board made a massive financial commitment to them, in part to repair what had happened during the Black empowerment controversy. I touched on this briefly in my sermon this morning, but this has come up again and again. And so in the 1980s, the racial justice issue came up. The journey towards wholeness came up in the late 90s. And so the legacy, to Steve's point, just keeps coming up and up and up again. And it informed the Commission on Institutional Change's work, which they are actually trying to do, or they are no longer trying to do. The commissioners on the Commission on Institutional Change gave their report, and now it's up to the UUA and congregations to take that work and do something with it. And they are. Susan Frederick Gray, that was her entire presidency, was to try to fix all of the things. If you want more information about the Commission on Institutional Change, you are welcome to ask my partner, who was a commissioner on the Commission for Institutional Change. So he can give you all of that. And just so you know, the archives, so all the stories that the Commission collected, will be made available sometime this year. So you can actually go in and read some of the stories of what happened. They're heartbreaking. They're really horrible.
And that's the cover of the book, The Widening the Circle, that has all the years of information in it. So we have 2 minutes. Jack.
The way you phrase it when the hiring controversy in 2017, I think you phrase it as following the hiring of a white man to the southern region, whatever. I know that with this whole investigation has found that there's white supremacy culture at play, and that's part of the remedy is to, but I think I wonder if the framing, the way you said, for those who don't dive deep, they hear people had issue with hiring a white man, as though you couldn't hire any white man without causing all this controversy, when actually there's probably a lot more to it. And I'm wondering if the UA is planning to help educate us about what white supremacy culture is more deeply, so that we can understand that there's more happening there than just objection to hiring a white man, but rather processes and whatnot. Because we do risk being perceived as the skull, as the way the right sees, they think that we would no white man can do anything. We have to get rid of all of them, and they are rebelling against that. We can't let ourselves be seen that way, right?
Right. Well, and what it came down to is that DEI did not exist in the UUA, like everybody, all these other corporations are doing that. And that was, so there is a there. You know, it's, you know, you have one white male that applies for the job, and you have a bunch of other demographically diverse people that are just as qualified that aren't being selected, and it's happening over and over. And when it happened that time in 2017, they're like, this is enough.
I would just also add that the hiring process, like you're right, Jack, there were a whole bunch of things that happened, but it was a pattern of behavior that had started way before that. And almost unanimously, everybody who was hired at the UUA was a minister, even if that didn't necessarily mean, even if that wasn't necessarily part of the qualifications that were needed for the job. So ministers were prioritized first, and then whiteness, and then maleness, over it, like in that order for almost everything. And that then went down into one person was on the hiring selection committee who happened to be a white male minister, right? So like it started with all of these other pieces so it was all the supremacy pieces that were named and all of that. You can read that full part in one of the appendices of the Widening Circle of Concern report.
It's hard to read that.
So it is past 11:15. Our minister wants us out of here by 11:15, and she's a stickler about that. So thank you all for coming.